Welcome back with a smiling face. Important note before starting: if you are a fan of audio stories, then our Patreon account is the best platform for you. Join us on Patreon for the best audiobooks ever. No End to Days. Episode 2. Hathersage, England. The living room was empty. A leather couch faced a crackling, lively fire. On the walls were paintings, and some portraits of Christ for fun. Chatter, voices, and incoherent sentences echoed from the hallway. I ran a long index fingernail along the top of the couch. My nail was pointed so sharp that it made the tiny fibers inside the soft cloth stick out at jagged angles. The flames roared. The fireplace was more than 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, with a mantel made of black oni. I sauntered past it. The year was 1602, the dwindling years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. I wore dresses made from the finest Persian silk and corsets that pushed my breasts so close together I was astonished a breathing human could survive the pressure. I swung my hips as I turned and sauntered down a long hallway lit only by wall sconces in the shape of 2 palms facing up. In the hands were candles that had burned almost into nothing. The waxy drops fell in succulent globs onto the floor. The train of my dress spread them across the wood in luscious zigzags as I headed toward a doorway at the end of the hall. When I glanced behind me, the grand fireplace threw orange embers of light into the dark hallway and outlined me in a dark tangerine line. I stopped in front of the doorway and listened. I could hear orchestral music and laughter. I didn't know it yet, but that night, October 31, 1602, was the last night of the very first Nuit Rouge celebration. I grasped the handle, which was shaped like a dagger facing downward. I pulled it open. Ancient greetings such as Merry Meet and Grand Tidings met my ears. There on the floor, in the center of the room, was a portly woman sitting on her heels. She wore a white wool dress that covered her up to her breasts, and a white bonnet on her head. Her blonde hair fell across her face as she muttered something in Dutch. It struck me that she was most likely someone's servant, though I did not recognize her. She probably had no idea her master was a vampire, and now here she was, in my house. The ballroom was lovely, I should mention. This servant's plump behind was seated on the finest wood floor in England. Tall torches rested high on the 4 circular stone pillars that supported the room. Their flames busily illuminated the dance floor, musicians played in the corner, and 200 vampires stood in a circle around the fat woman. Rode leaned against a pillar watching me, smiling. His arms were crossed over his chest. His ensemble was simple. He wore black leggings and solid black shoes with thin leather soles that were flat with no heels. The clothing at the time was very rich in texture, and wealthy vampires loved to show off. Rode wore a black linen jacket fastened with a thick black ribbon. The muscles of his arms were well defined under the tight sleeves of the black jacket. He must have just fed, because his teeth looked whiter than I had seen them in ages. I walked languidly around the inner part of the circle of vampires. I held my eyes on Rode until I reached the ballroom doorway, which now was open and showed the long hallway and the dance of light from the fireplace. The woman in the middle of the room kept glancing at the hallway. I felt, as always with my vampire extrasensory perception, what this woman wanted. She wanted to make a run for it. "Do you know why you are here?" I asked the woman, speaking to her in Dutch. I circled her very slowly, keeping my hands behind my back. She sat on her heels watching me. She shook her head no. "Do you know what I am?" I asked. Again, she shook her head. "I wanted to leave," she said, her voice quivering. "My mother and father." I raised my index finger and placed it over my lips. Images from my human life drifted to the front of my mind. My parents' stone manor. The wet earth. An earring in a palm. I refocused on the servant's features. Her keen blue eyes, their round shape and short blonde eyelashes. I stopped circling and stood above her, looking down. "You know," I said, and smiled. "The moment before the vampire will kill, the fangs lower. At first they appear as regular teeth, but when the kill is happening, like an animal, the fangs are bared." And mine lowered, I felt them lower, as though slowly unfolding a blade. I bent over and looked deeply into her eyes. I whispered into her right ear, "You're going to taste horrible. Look at your disposition." I pulled back and looked into her eyes again. "I wouldn't dare sully my insides with what you are." I stood back up. For a moment, relief swept over her face. I walked past her, the low heels of my black leather shoes clicking against the wooden floor. The train of my gown swiveled behind me like a snake. I threw one long glance back at Rode and smiled. It was silent in the ballroom. The musicians had stopped playing. I was midway back down the hallway when I lifted my right hand in the air, bent my wrist down, and snapped my fingers. 200 vampires descended upon her at once. I smiled all the way back up to my bedroom. The library at Wickham was a Gothic masterpiece with panoramic glass windows. I entered through the 2 double doors, taking in the plush chairs, rows and rows of books, and students investigating the stacks. Decorating the ceiling were 3-dimensional, octagonal tiles made out of black wood. "Your job, Ms. Bodanti, is to sit here behind this desk. When people ask you questions, you answer them to the best of your ability. You can always direct them to a librarian if you can't answer something they want to know." The librarian, who was leading me on a tour, was a tall woman with a thin nose and eyes shaped like a cat. These contemporary humans were so horribly misinformed. I was a former vampire who had been asleep the last 100 years. They expected me to act as a reference guide? "You get paid every Friday. I'll have your semester schedule at the end of your shift at 7 p.m. Headmistress Williams also suggested you tutor some of the students in their language skills, as you are so proficient. I'll make a sign for you to put up on the miscellaneous bulletin board at the Union." Once she walked away, I collapsed into a chair behind the semicircular reference desk. Wickham Private School certainly was going to keep me busy. In front of me was a computer, which basically blinded me with its blue light. There were all sorts of contraptions I had never seen before: staplers, ballpoint pens, paper clips, printers, and electrical outlets. Keyboards, virtual desktops, search engines. These were just some of the hundreds of words that I had to learn in order to fit in, and quickly. To assimilate within Wickham, or, as Rode would say, to become a teenage girl again, would require all of my best efforts. This society was particularly complicated. I glanced at the clock around 4:30 and realized I had 2 more hours on my shift. I decided to explore the library. I walked aisle after aisle, deep into the depths of the stacks, taking in the beauty of Wickham's library. As I turned into the last aisle of books, a girl's laughter echoed from somewhere nearby. It was a kind of vibrating chortle that came from deep within her, bouncing under her ribs. Pure laughter. I wanted to see who she was. I raised on my tiptoes and peered over the tops of the books. Running parallel to the row were study atriums with glass walls and panoramic windows. Inside the room were deeply padded, blue couches and study desks. The row of books was a good hiding place because I could duck down behind the shelves, if I needed to. I peered over the top of the books again and kept walking, following the laughter. I stopped short, just when I realized who the laughing girl was. Tracy Sutton, Justin's girlfriend. They were in the very last study atrium. Justin was relaxing in a lounger, and Tracy sat on his lap. In chairs on either side of him were his brothers Curtis and Roy. Tracy laughed that same happy sound again. It struck me how easily people laughed in this age. How easily they could express their happiness. I had forgotten what that was like. Justin was tall, very tall, so Tracy looked tiny in his lap. If I had been in Tracy's place, my legs would have dangled over Justin's knees like a spider's. Tracy stood up and shrieked something unintelligible. The other members of the three-piece, Kate and Claudia, stood on either side of her and pulled down the sides of their matching jeans to expose their hip bones. I raised higher on my toes and stared. They were wearing matching undergarments made to look like leopard skin. Claudia hung an arm over Kate's shoulders, and Tracy slipped back into Justin's lap. I couldn't help it, the staring, I mean. I was transfixed by their happiness. I was especially drawn to Justin. He had this aura. There is no other way to explain his life force. The image of his chest dripping with rain flashed through my head. And how his lips looked when he formed words. Especially when he asked me if I was sad. I wanted him to talk to me more. I am so not into morning assembly, Tracy said, and then kissed Justin's cheek. She was facing in my direction. I gasped and ducked down out of sight. I didn't want anyone to see me. Not from that group, anyway. I peered through the space between the shelf and the tops of the books. I'd had a human reaction to Justin Enos. The flip-flopping of my heart and the way my breath skipped around in my chest. Would it have been this way for Rode? Would Vicken, if he were human again, possibly have jitters when he looked at me? Justin reached around Tracy and his palms rested on her thighs. As I examined him, by some horrible chaotic coincidence, Justin, who was looking at one of his brothers, furrowed his eyebrows and stopped speaking. His smile fell, and he turned his head, so I could see not just his profile but his whole mouth. Then, the sharp point of his nose, then his eyes, staring directly into mine. Ms. Bodanti. I spun around. The librarian with the cat-shaped eyes stood before me. She held a black crate filled with slim plastic cases. Please alphabetize these CDs in the listening room. Listening room? I said, wondering what on earth a listening room could be. Had the modern world evolved so much that people sat in a room and simply listened? The librarian handed me the crate and pointed down the aisle of atriums to a room at the end. When I didn't move, she sighed. This way. I followed behind her. She shuffled when she walked, as though her hips and behind were too heavy for her to pick up her feet properly. As a vampire, I would have been able to murder her in less than 10 seconds. She looked back at me and motioned for me to hurry up. I decided to stop thinking about her slow gait and my deft ability to lure my prey. I peeked into the crate. The slim cases held names, some of which I recognized. I slid one of them out. On it, I read the name George Friedrich Handel. What was this? Handel was a musician, a composer. What on earth could those cases have to do with him? I flipped the case over. The artwork depicted a man wearing a white wig, a wig I had seen on countless men during the 17th and 18th centuries. The wig curled on both sides of the man's face and was held back into a ponytail. He held a small composing baton above a full orchestra. Only when the librarian's clip-clopping heels came to a stop did I realize that we had come to the listening room. Justin and his friends were at the long end of the hall. The librarian opened a black door with a paned window in the middle. She pointed inside the room. Running over the walls was a thick, gray fabric that was very dense but soft to the touch. I let my fingers graze the plush material that crawled on the walls. Facing me was a towering, black machine that took over the entire wall. The librarian pointed at a wall of shelves. Just place them on the racks and organize them by the last name. The wall was filled with cases just like the ones in the crate. Would you mind showing me how the machine works? I asked, referring to the monstrous, black tower to the right of the cases. On a desk in front of it were 3 computers. Which CD do you want to listen to? She asked. I picked up the CD that said Handel Opera in swirling white cursive across the front of the case. But the last opera I had seen was in the 1740s, in Paris. I shook my head. I remembered that night too well. And that was not a night I wanted to recall while I stood in a room with a stranger. She pressed a button, and a small tray slid forward all on its own. I felt my eyes widen. Everything that involved machinery in this age was so easy. One simple push, and magic happened. She opened the case and took out a silver disc. You place the CD in the slot, press the button on the stereo, and there you go. You can turn it up to volume 10, no one can hear. This room is soundproof. The musicians listen to their CDs at an unreasonable volume. She turned the knob up to the 10 setting and closed the door behind her, leaving me in the silence, for a moment. I stuck my hand into the box of CDs, waiting to line them up accordingly when music came out of the speakers. I stood up and backed away from the stereo. The aria was Handel's Se Pieta and it moved throughout the room, wafting over the foam walls and carpeted floor. Finally, it settled into me. The feeling of the drawn-out strings, the vibrations of the cellos, flowed through my body like blood. Violins, many of them, how many, I could not decipher. I could almost feel the bow moving across the strings. My lips parted, and my breath escaped in a slow exhale. The cellos came next. The low melancholy strings made goosebumps roll over my arms. I reached forward and touched the tiny holes of the place where the music came out. I could feel the machine vibrating from the sound. How on earth was this possible? Had so much time passed that humans were able to contain any music they wanted? Keep it somewhere so they could listen to it over and over again? I brought my hand to my chest when a woman began to sing an aria. Her voice cascaded through the notes, soared with the violins and matched the cello's harmonies. I couldn't help it. I slowly knelt down to the floor and closed my eyes. It was a kind of beauty I could not have fathomed before that moment, music that I could finally feel with my body and my soul. In 1740, opera was popular, but you had to travel to attend performances. Now it was in the listening room at Wickham boarding school. I closed my eyes even tighter and let the sound pass through me. Like a whisper on bare skin, the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt a pair of hands rest on my shoulders. I kept my eyes closed. "Have you learned Italian yet?" a voice whispered in my ear. Except the voice was in my head and I was remembering the last time I'd heard that song in 1740, in Paris, with Rode. "You're not really here," I whispered. "Didn't I tell you? Anywhere you go, I will go," the voice whispered. But I knew I was alone in that listening room, in a century I knew nothing about, the ghost of Rode my only company. "What are you doing?" said a voice that was clearly not Rhode's. My eyes flew open. I looked right. Justin Enos held the door open and the three-piece passed behind him, looking in at me through the glass. I had the sudden realization that I was on my knees, and I stood up from the floor immediately. "Listening," I said, though it was more like a yell. Justin gestured to the stereo. "Can I?" I nodded, unsure what he was doing there. I fiddled aimlessly with the CDs. He turned down the volume so the song was no louder than a whisper. "Why are you here?" I asked. "I wanted to know what you were listening to because the look on your face was like you were in pain or something." "But it was just classical music." "It's not just classical." His eyebrows furrowed, and I looked away toward the CDs again. But I had to look back. Justin's shirt was unbuttoned just one button too far, just enough so I could see the cleft in between his chest muscles. A deep ravine of bronzed skin. I wanted to run my finger over it. It was just a simple, small button, but it looked as though it was a forgotten button, as if getting dressed in a hurry was something he did often. He followed my eyes, looked down to his shirt, and immediately reached his long fingers up to close the button. I grabbed a CD from the crate, disappointed. "You look like you'd never heard music before," he said. "I haven't," I said. "Not like that." I focused on the last name on a CD in the crate. Madonna, a composer I'd never heard of. I placed the CD with the others whose last name began with M. "You've never heard music on a stereo?" "Not exactly." "And you chose opera?" I looked up. Justin's expression was a mix of amazement and sheer confusion. Perhaps he thought I was strange, but in that moment, I could feel it, he was enthralled. My eyes traveled over his shoulder to one of Justin's brothers peeking into the listening room, the older one, the one with earrings in his ear. Behind him, members of the three-piece giggled to one another, hiding their mouths by turning their heads when I caught their eyes. "I have to go," I said, shoving the last CDs carelessly at the end of the row. I pushed past so my shoulder grazed Justin's arm. It was warm, as though he'd been sitting in the sun. As I walked away, past them, I didn't look back. Even as they laughed at my expense, I could feel the vibrations of the woman's soprano in the middle of my chest, somewhere very close to my heart. Chapter 6. First day of classes. What to wear? Wickham didn't have uniforms, so it was a bit of a gamble. The weather was still so warm despite it being early September. Jeans and a simple black tank top that seemed like a safe bet. No odd colors that were out of fashion. Just simple. Tony said he would meet me outside Seekers so we could walk to assembly together. Strength in numbers, I thought after my debacle in the listening room with Justin. The morning of the first day of school, I had a few minutes before I had to meet Tony. I went into my kitchen. It was a small alcove, with modest wooden cabinets and a small counter space. Rode had stocked it with pans, silverware, and other kitchen tools. Yet, the most important items were on the counter to the right of the sink. Spices and dried flowers were stacked neatly in black, circular tins against the wall. The smallest black canister read dandelion. Of course, I thought. Dried dandelion. The dried flower head is no larger than a dime and is meant to be carried for luck. If I was to assimilate into human life as Rode had requested, I needed all the luck I could get. That, and a clock seemed to reside in my mind. During moments of silence when the distractions of this new age subsided, I could hear the seconds click past. Each tick-tock brought me closer and closer to the final night of Nuit Rouge. I shook my head as though to rid myself of these thoughts, stuck a dandelion head in my pocket, and grabbed a bundle of rosemary that was tied together. I stuck a tack in the door and hung the rosemary from it. I did this so that every time I came back to my dorm apartment, the safe place that I would call home, I would never forget where I came from. And how much farther I still had to go. With my backpack on, I locked the door behind me. I stepped out of Seeker and found Tony on the lawn, lying on his back with his hands behind his head, basking in the morning sun. I pulled the wide-brimmed, floppy hat over my head. Tony was wearing the ripped jeans again and a belt decorated by metal spikes. "Aren't you afraid of getting burned?" I asked, and placed my sunglasses over my eyes. Tony hopped up. He pointed at me so that his backpack dangled off his right elbow. "Okay, the security guard told me that you live in Professor Bennett's old place. If that's the top floor apartment, then yes," I said. "The top floor apartment," Tony mocked me and exaggerated my British accent. He blinked twice and his jaw dropped. "Professor Bennett died in July," Tony clarified. His eyes were wide and his thin lips parted. He was waiting for me to react. "When I didn't," he continued. "They still don't know how he died except he had 2 holes in his throat. Made all the psychics and nut jobs in town claim vampires." I rolled my eyes. "Rode. So?" I asked. "What does that have to do with me moving in? It's September. The guy died 2 months ago. That doesn't freak you out at all?" I shrugged. "Not really. Death has never really bothered me." "Why doesn't that surprise me, Lena?" Tony asked, and threw his arm over my shoulder. "I guess you don't care about vampires, either. Do you believe they exist?" I asked him. "Anything's possible." "No, Tony," I thought. "Not anything. Some things, dangerous things. Other vampires could have lived in Lover's Bay, Massachusetts, though I had never heard of any in that part of the world. Vampires generally know about one another geographically, that is, and either way, what could I have done if they were there?" "Do you?" he asked. "Believe? Why not?" I replied. Tony hugged me close to him so my left shoulder pressed against his rib cage and I could feel his body heat. The sudden closeness made my mouth water. In the vampire state a kind of salivation takes place. The fangs come down and then the vampire feels the instinct to bite. I pulled away and pretended to reach into my backpack. The pumping in my heart echoed within me, and I pressed my hand over my chest as if it would quiet it down. I pulled out an official document from the bottom of the bag and pretended to look at it. Was I salivating because of Tony's body heat? Did I want his blood? I concentrated on some sharp blades of grass. I swallowed to make sure the saliva had died away. I looked up at Tony. He had walked up the path a few feet ahead of me. I couldn't help but notice the way he walked, a long step with a small hop. His feet were a little big for his body, too. He was wearing a pair of black boots that day, though one was different from the other. I'm not sure if anyone with regular sight would have noticed, but the stitching around the right boot was different from the one on the left. "You coming?" Tony called. "Assembly will start without us." No, I decided. I most definitely did not want his blood. I stood and jogged to catch up. When I reached Tony's side, he smiled at me and we continued up the path. Tony's breezy attitude made it easy for me to hide my vampire instincts. He didn't seem to mind when I acted strangely. I ran my tongue over my front teeth before speaking. I had to make sure. "Are you from Lover's Bay originally?" I asked, trying to distract myself from what just happened. "Yep." Tony sighed. "My parents live right on the border of Lover's Bay, in the really, interesting part of town." "Interesting?" I asked. "Let me put it to you this way, you'd be scared just looking down the street." I smirked. "Right. So how'd you score a professor's dorm residence?" Tony asked. "Everyone else has to live in regular dorm rooms. My dad rented it for the 2 years I'll be going to school here," I explained. "Wow," Tony said, raising his eyebrows. He navigated through the pathways toward Hopper Building. As we walked the twists and turns of the walkways, I glanced at Tony's face. He held his jaw loosely but smiled in a happy, relaxed way. Tony's disposition was gentle, and I could feel his energy. Vampires can feel human energy and pick up on the emotional intentions of those around them. Tony had never in his life hurt someone as I had, nor had he felt unrelenting fear. I wanted to protect him in any way that I could, and before I knew what was happening, my hand was reaching for his. I dropped it back at my side and pretended like nothing happened. Luckily, he didn't notice. Outside dorms, in walkways, and on the lawns, more students flung themselves at one another, crying in happiness and taking pictures of one another on cell phones. Tony held out his arm toward me. He used his index finger to pretend he was snapping a photo. "Oh, my God," he cried, and grasped his hand to his heart. "I have to take your picture because, I haven't seen you in 5 minutes. Pose." I placed my right hand on my hip and smiled genuinely. Tony dropped his arms by his side, and his face fell. "You can pose better than that." "How should I pose?" I asked, not sure which kind of pose was acceptable in this century. "Forget it, Lena," he said, laughing. Tony grabbed my hand and led me back toward the path. I let him pull me, and I smiled at his fingers grasped around mine. But his fingers had no age. Black smudges of paint dotted his hands and fingers. They were soft, without wear, and I realized that Rode was the last person to hold me that way. I let go of Tony's hand. I was in Switzerland for 2 months, a younger girl shrieked next to us while grasping her friend in a tight hug. And your hair is so blonde. Tony looked at me from the corner of his eye and then stifled a laugh. My extrasensory perception was a bit like a radio signal, it kept picking up the emotional reads from the people around me. There were so many: excitement, longing, shame, anxiety. I could list a whole host of emotions. The walkway we were on snaked in front of Quartz dorm. I couldn't help but peek at Justin's window. It was dark, though the window was open and a coffee mug sat on the windowsill. As I kept stride with Tony, I obsessed over the students interacting with one another. If I was supposed to be one of them, I had to act as one of them. They wore bejeweled rings, expensive silver or gold watches, and accessories of every kind. A lot of the girls held their hair back with elaborate tortoiseshell clips. Perhaps I could find some for me in the clothing stores. I almost forgot Tony's promise to teach me how to drive. With the introduction of my new job and my fascination with how-to manuals, I hadn't taken Tony up on his promise. I got a job, I said while we waited in the line of the students congregating to get into Hopper. That explains Saturday. I came by Seeker to see you, Tony said. You must have been working. Where at? Library. Rough deal. I work for the yearbook. Kind of a work-study thing, Tony explained. Yearbook? What's that? I asked. We stepped underneath the shaded awning of Hopper, and I pulled my hair off my shoulders and fastened it with a black clip. You don't know what a yearbook is? Tony gave me a look that said, how could you not know what that is? But it faded fast. It's this book that comes out at the end of every school year. We take pictures all year, record what happens, and put it together. To, remember. What happened? So you take the photographs. Tony nodded. I should take some pictures of first assembly. Everyone always wears their best clothes. It's really annoying. Is that your best spiked belt? I asked, smirking. He slid a camera out of his pocket so fast, I didn't even know what was happening. Then a light flashed in my eyes. I yelped so that the back of my throat burned. The scream was quick and short but enough to have all of the students standing in line turn to look at me. Tony laughed and laughed. Wow, he said. I should scare you more often. Are you crazy? You can't just flash a bright light at someone. It could hurt them. Tony placed a hand on my shoulder. Lena, it's just a camera. Maybe you like my fake one better, but this one won't hurt, promise. Right, I thought. Must learn to control that. The line of students started to move. Thanks for walking with me today, I said. You don't have to thank me. I like it. All the guys on campus think you're hot, so this works out for me. I'll follow you to class, your dorm, Main Street, he said with a smile as we moved into the doorway of Hopper. There was a tug on my heart. I looked to the ground as the image below my feet went from the grass to the tile of the hopper foyer. "Anywhere you go, I will go," echoed in my head. I walked with Tony in a sea of students, though I wasn't part of it. I didn't feel like I was, anyway. I couldn't jump, hug, or tell anyone anything that wouldn't scare them out of my life forever. And there, in the slow-moving line into the auditorium, the memory of the opera came back to me. Paris, France Opera, Intermission. 1740. I extinguished the candle flames with the tips of my fingers, and then I waited in the darkness. There, in the shadow of the velvet seats and gilded gold railing, a couple stepped into the balcony. I killed them both before an utter of a scream left their mouths. I'd never murdered anyone in a public crowd before. They were a well-refined royal couple, and their blood tasted sweet and surprisingly satisfying. I used their bodies as footrests for the first and second act of the opera, Julio César, my favorite. A line of blood dripped down the front of my silk gown, spotting my tangerine-colored shoes, but I waited for something else, the relief from the sheer agony that lived in my mind. That is what happened after murdering a victim. There was an instantaneous but brief relief from the emotional pain. I sat down on the plush seat and rested my feet on the chest of the young man I had murdered. Surely it would come now, any moment. Another crimson droplet fell, clinging to the white pearl beading that circled the hem of my gown. The dress itself was a deep red color, the finest silk in Paris. I waited, uninterested in the chatter of the crowd awaiting the final act of the opera. I only realized that a long drop of blood fell off my chin when it splattered onto my cleavage. It seemed as though an invisible hand pressed on every inch of my being. My shoulders and my arms were tensed like hard stone. I waited, and waited for the relief. I sighed, out of habit, and looked down at the unmoving palm of the young woman under my feet. It will always be this way, I thought, and kicked her hand out of spite. Even if she were still alive, the maniacal pain rushing through my veins would never calm. There would always be this tempest, never a breeze. The curtain rose, and I closed my eyes, waiting to be engulfed by blackness and sound. It would be safe there in the darkness of my mind. The only place I knew I could go to forget even just for a moment what I had become. The orchestra began to play, and I let the violins make colors of peace, whites, blues, and a whole symphony of color. Violins swirled in my head. I could see the ivory fibers of the bows as they crossed the strings, over and back again. The woman's operatic soprano filled the room from the stage. She began her aria, Se Pieta. She hit a surprisingly high note, though I had no physical reaction to its beauty. The collective reaction of the crowd told me that she was no common opera singer. She was able to move people through their bodies, through their souls. For me, the aria put out the light. It dimmed the spark so I could sink into the sound. I gripped the chair when I sensed a shift in the air and a pair of hands gently caressed my shoulders. Then Rhodes' lips were close to my ear. He sat down behind me. "Have you learned Italian yet?" he whispered. I shook my head, my lips parting. "Too bad," he said. His chin almost rested on my shoulder. "What is she saying?" I whispered. "That she is Cleopatra, and her grand plan is collapsing around her." The love road felt for me coursed through my shoulders, down to my feet, and I wished I could shiver. The vampire emotion of love works in just this manner, as a reaction of fulfillment relief. Murdering my victims for their blood wasn't working anymore. The love Rode and I shared was all I had left. "She thinks her love is dead," he said. I opened my eyes to Rode's stare, that rugged face whose features softened only for me. He had sat down next to me. The singer, dressed in an Egyptian costume, raised her hands from her sides and knelt before the stage bed. "The game has lost its sport," I said. Around Rode and me, the singer's voice crescendoed with the orchestra. It was a deafening beauty. I felt the crowd's swelling emotion, the union of their happiness. I ached. The music calms me. But I know I will forget myself again. The savagery prevails, the pain returns, and the longing to hurt takes over. It always does. "How do you bear it?" I asked. "I'm on the brink." "You," he said calmly, plainly. He took my hand into his and brought my fingers to his mouth. Under my nails was some leftover blood. He licked it away. "I think about you, and it's enough." "How?" "We are allowed very little, Lena. I focus my energies not on the pain but on what I can do to avoid it. So I am your distraction." "You," he said, his face coming within inches of mine, "are my only hope." I surveyed Rode's beautiful features. His eyes probed mine for a reaction. I placed a hand on his cheek. "I'm unraveling. I know now. No amount of blood or violence will alleviate the loss I experience every day. I want to run my fingers along skin and feel it. I want to sleep, wake, laugh with a crowd. This," I pointed to the dead couple, "is no longer enough." Rode brought my fingertips back to his lips. He closed his eyes as the aria swelled around us. "Let's go," he said, opening his eyes and then standing up. "To where?" I asked. "Anywhere," he said. His eyes set into mine and bore deeply into what would have been my soul, if I had one. "Anywhere you go, I will go," he said. We turned from the balcony, the only indication of our presence, the carnage. "This way, Lena," Tony said, and I shook my head, focusing back on the doorway into the auditorium. Once we entered, I could see why Rode had sent me to Wickham. It was easily the most elegant school I had ever seen. The auditorium rivaled some of the more beautiful homes I had experienced over the last 5 centuries. The walls and ceilings were modern. Nothing in my home in Hathersage was made from metal, just stone and wood. Wickham was different. It was the kind of place where lights were encased in stained glass and they brightened with the easy push of a finger. The seats rose up and away from a single podium in the center of the room. The stairs leading up to the many rows of seats were lined with a red carpet and track lighting. "Just the upper school has an assembly here," Tony explained as we walked up the stairs. Many of the students congregated in tight groups. "Sit over here," Tony said, and showed me to a few rows of seats to the far left. All the kids already seated there were dressed like Tony. Some had interesting shades of hair, and one older boy had his mouth and eyebrow pierced. Gavin, a vampire in my coven, loved stakes and knives. He would have enjoyed piercing himself. Perhaps he had by now. I didn't see Justin. I have to admit, I hoped to. Though I did see his horrible girlfriend, Tracy Sutton, and her 2 friends sitting across the aisle. The self-proclaimed 3-piece were sitting together, heads close, whispering. Tracy looked up and caught my eye. I looked away. When I sat down, I removed my backpack and placed it at my feet. I couldn't help it. I turned back to look at her and watched her mouth move. She leaned to the smallest of the blonde girls and said, "That new girl is sitting with the art kids." The small blonde girl turned her head, and I looked away just quick enough. "She's pretty," she said. Tracy scoffed. "Whatever. She's paler than me in mid-November, and what's up with that tattoo on her left shoulder? Can you say weird?" It was a needle scratch on a record moment. The palm to the forehead, stupid things I had completely forgotten about. I was so stupid. I had completely forgotten about my tattoo. An expression is tattooed on the back of my left shoulder. Only those in my coven had these words tattooed on their skin. "Evil be he who thinketh evil." I pressed my lips together and I looked about the room. What was I going to do? How would I explain that phrase to everyone who saw it? Especially the girls in the three-piece. I pressed my back into the seat so no one else would be able to see the tattoo. I let my hair down though I knew when I walked or moved anyone would be able to see it. The straps of the tank top were extremely thin. It was a poor fashion choice, but I had no time to run across campus and change. I hated that I could read lips. I hated my vampire sight. I wished I had worn a sweater. Tony must have noticed I was staring at them because he leaned over to me. "Why do they call themselves the three-piece again?" "Because they are always together. The three of them. Tracy Sutton, Claudia Hawthorne, and Kate Pearson. Rich, popular, and dangerous. Kate is a weekday student. She lives with her family in Chatham. How can those three girls possibly be dangerous?" Almost as I was saying the words, I understood what road meant that day in the fields as well as what Tony meant. These girls were effortlessly beautiful. They flipped their hair with ease and a carefree swipe of their hand. They were dangerous because in their beauty they believed they held all their power. Ms. Williams spoke and ruined my examination of the three-piece. "Students and faculty, please take your seats," she said over a microphone. The chatter slowed, there was a bustling of bodies, and after a few moments everyone sat down. I still didn't see Justin anywhere. "Welcome back. It is my privilege this morning, as it is each year, to welcome you to another academic year at Wickham. What is my wish? For you to achieve the highest level of education available. For you to grow not only academically but as young adults. Here at Wickham you are the best example of this country's future. And as the upper school, you are the example for the rest of Wickham boarding school." "Blah blah blah," Tony whispered in my right ear, and my chest warmed. I was grateful to have him by my side. Before we dive into the highly anticipated schedule changes, there is some preliminary news. We have accepted only 4 new students to join the upper school this year. Can you all come down to the podium, please? Lena Bodonti, Elizabeth McKiernan, Monica Wilcox, and Lois Rakin. My stomach dropped. This was not going to be good. To my left, 3 students stood up and began the walk down the long aisles toward Ms. Williams. I looked to Tony, my eyes wide and my mouth dropped. He held his hand over his mouth. His big shoulders bounced up and down. Even though his mouth was covered, I could see the apples of his cheeks were red with glee. If only he knew what my tattoo meant, once I stood up, everyone would see it. Everyone would ask. I stood up. Don't fall, I prayed. Don't you dare fall. I stepped down, one sandaled foot at a time. I ripped off the floppy hat so the brim squished in my right hand. Slowly, but surely, I made my way to Ms. Williams. I was careful not to look anywhere but at the stairs in front of me. I could already hear some whispering. The tattoo was small. No larger than average textbook print, but the scrawling cursive was specific. It was Rhodes' handwriting etched into my skin with ink, blood, candle flame, and a small needle. Ms. Williams stepped to the left of the podium to allow room for us. The other 3 students faced the audience. I did the same. Then I felt a hand on my left shoulder. "Why don't you go first, Lena? Just tell them a little about yourself," she whispered. I stepped up to the microphone. I could only assume I was supposed to talk into it, as I had seen Ms. Williams do. It exaggerated her voice, and I already had an even, smooth cadence. The student body stared. Hundreds of mortal eyes looked at me and waited for me to say something that would define me within their world. "I'm Lena Bodanti, and this is thoroughly mortifying." Laughter erupted. I could feel that they were laughing with me and not at me. My hands gripped the side of the podium. I searched for Tony, who gave me a thumbs up. It was then that I noticed Justin Enos sat in the seat directly behind mine. My heart thumped in my chest, and I had to look away. He had also seen the tattoo. He must have. Either way, he looked unbelievable. Delicious, even. His skin was bronzed, a golden color that one could only achieve from being in the direct line of the sun. I wondered for an instant if I touched him how warm he would be. "I'm from a small town in England, if you couldn't tell from the accent. I'm 16, and, well, I guess that's it for now." I walked back to my seat, this time exposing my tattoo to the teachers who were seated behind me. The whole time I stepped up the stairs I locked eyes with Justin. His lips made it clear what he was thinking. I felt like a hybrid, half beast, half human, because it was easy for me to read him. He looked straight at me, with a smirk. One where his lips just rested on the edge of a smile. He didn't have to speak to me in the rain. He didn't have to say anything out loud because he said it all with his eyes. "I want you." Chapter 7. As soon as assembly was over, everyone started to move toward the exits. I didn't want to seem eager to Justin, so when Tony and I finally stood up to make our way to class, I turned around casually. But Justin had gone. I didn't like this position. Wasn't he supposed to be following me? I wasn't supposed to be wondering about him, hoping he was behind me. How frustrating. Once we were in the hallway, I pulled my backpack close to my body so that my tattoo was covered. "That tattoo is really cool," Tony said, confirming my fears. We walked out of the auditorium down the main hallway of Hopper. "Oh, it's nothing," I replied. "Nothing? That tattoo is not nothing. When did you get it done? Who did it? That's some serious ink." "An artist in London," I said, though my mind flashed to a memory. I was in Hathersage, stomach down on the floor of the living room. Underneath me was a scarlet-red, Persian rug road brought back from India sometime in the 16th century. A fire roared in the oversized fireplace. I was topless, but only my back was exposed. Rode was on his knees working the scripture into my back. Around Tony and me, students wandered the halls, most with Wickham folders in their hands. There must have been 100 middle schoolers wandering through Hopper Building. The moment reminded me of a castle in Venice during Carnivale. Hundreds of costumed Venetians held masks over their faces. Lions, feathers, sparkling gems, and flowing goblets spilled onto the floor. Just like this moment, it was disarming to be surrounded by so many strangers. There was no face I recognized, just eyes catching my gaze. Though, in 1605, in my confusion, I murdered the great Doge Marino when he refused to stop following me throughout the castle. I ripped his neck out and was quite full before dawn crept over the canals of Venice. I greatly regretted it all that next day, as I had no idea I had murdered my host. What was a girl to do? He kept following me around telling me how beautiful I was. Also, I was so bored. So, she's sitting there on her knees. Like, crying, a voice said, tearing me out of my memory. Tracy stood in the hallway and flipped her hair over her shoulder. She talked to the members of the three-piece as well as Justin. They stood around her at the base of some stairs. There were a few other girls standing about I didn't know. Tracy hit Justin casually on the shoulder. Justin goes in there and says, like, "What is wrong with you?" "What did she say?" one of the girls I didn't know asked while she sipped on a soda. Tracy looked to Justin, but he simply shrugged in response. She lied. She said she'd never heard music on a stereo before. Justin looked up from the group and when he locked eyes on me, his eyes were polite surprised, even. My cheeks warmed, and I felt a stirring in my chest. I wanted to scream at Tracy and throw her to the ground. Instead, I sighed and turned to Tony, who smiled apologetically. "The English floor is up there," he said, and pointed at a staircase. "I can go up with you, if you want." The position I was in with Tracy was not to be taken lightly. I needed to go up alone. "No," I said, though my tone was thankful. I looked back to the group, but they had started up the stairs. "I'll be all right," I said, grateful I wouldn't have to pass by them after they had just talked about me in that manner. "I'll see you tonight." "Dinner." I nodded and started to climb. "Don't forget," Tony said, calling after me. I turned around. "Bob," he said, sounding out the letters. I laughed and ascended the stairs. Advanced English. Apparently, when I took the placement test that Saturday morning, I had scored higher than last year's valedictorian. On the second floor there were doors made out of mahogany with glass-plated windows and a shiny tiled floor. I walked down the hallway, past 2 or 3 glass doors, and looked down at my schedule. I pressed on a wooden door with the numbers 205 painted in black and entered AP English. This classroom had a semicircular shape, a chalkboard in the center of the room, and the teacher standing in the middle was a man named Professor Lin. He was a short man, with a slight build and a receding hairline. His bald spot was the size of a $50. Most students were just taking their seats. I didn't see anyone I knew except Tracy. I sat as far away from her as possible. As I walked, I noticed a familiar curve of a spine seated next to Tracy. The person had a wide, well-toned back that was hidden underneath a black button-down. It was Justin, and he was seated next to Tracy. I sat down without glancing in their direction. Professor Lin turned to the class from writing on the blackboard. Kate Chopin. The Awakening 1899. Can someone tell me if this novel is a romance, a thriller? What genre is this? Professor Lin asked, catching my glance. So I guess we're just going to jump right into this, I thought. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled the book from my bag. It was a brand new, softcover copy that I had bought with Tony at the bookstore. Anyone? Professor Lin pressed. Again, no one responded. How about our new comedian? He referred to his class roster. I knew what was going to happen, luckily retaining my vampire ability to read people's emotional intentions. I knew it, like an instinct, that Professor Lin wanted to challenge me. He came toward my desk and crossed his arms over his chest. Did you read the first 50 pages? You should have received a letter and syllabus over the summer with instructions. I nodded. Although I'd received no letter while I was hibernating 6 feet under the ground, I thought it best I didn't mention that particular detail. Why don't you tell us what you think, Ms. Lena? He referred to his roster, Ms. Lena Bodanti. What are your initial reactions to The Awakening? What would you like to know? I asked without removing my eyes from Professor Lin's. He was using me as an example, setting the stage a power struggle. After the incident by the stairs with Tracy, I was going to win. Our stares were resentful, his eyes unforgiving. If Professor Lin had ever been made into a vampire, he would have been frightening. I asked what you thought of The Awakening. The initial 50 pages. Any aspect of it, Professor Lin said. The smugness in his voice was sickening. Just another example of human nature, I thought. Justin sniggered. I had never been in a classroom before this moment and already I didn't like it. Tracy rubbed her knee against Justin's and they both smiled at my stymied response. I shot a glance at them and then looked back to Professor Lin. Well, I said, I'm not a girl who likes to be controlled. The main character, Edna Pontellier, was controlled her whole life. That's the book. The main character acts out against the social restrictions against her. She feels trapped. Now, if you are truly asking my opinion and not anticipating my failure in completing the assignment, I think it's a dreadful book. Silence. Then chuckles. Dreadful. Tracy whispered in Justin's ear, mocking me. You can tell all that from the first 50 pages. Professor Lin asked, his eyebrows raised. I've read the book before, sir. Now they weren't laughing. I scooted down farther into the seat and crossed my left leg over my right knee. My legs looked long and spindly. Professor Lin walked to his desk and then turned back to face me. You've already read The Awakening. I have a first copy, first hardcover edition, in my home in Hathersage, you fool. Yes, sir. 3 times. An hour later, I dropped my English books into my bag. After scanning the room for Justin, I walked toward the doorway. Miss Bodanti. I turned. Professor Lin held out a handwritten note on a piece of paper. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and walked toward his desk to retrieve it. Because you are so experienced with the awakening and the rest of the class is not, I am going to assign you a few more written tasks than everyone else. It's not fair, Lena. Your literary experience puts you at an advantage. I nodded, though I was silently kicking myself. I could have easily pretended I had never read the novel if I hadn't made a spectacle of myself and Professor Lin hadn't singled me out. It didn't seem very fair. Though, what could I say, really? Before a few days ago, I wasn't much educated in the business of justice. I wouldn't dare sully my insides with what you are. My voice echoed in my mind. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes as a wave of relief flowed through me. I couldn't access that kind of evil in my human state. Not yet, at least. It was with that thought I reached the door of the classroom. You think she's pretty, Tracy said in an accusatory way. I stopped walking immediately. No, Justin replied, though I knew he was lying. I knew what a lie sounded like. I was brilliant at telling them. Yes, you do. I know you do. You were staring at her in class. Professor Lin was grilling her. She's a slut, Tracy said. And I heard she's dating Tony Sasaki. Yeah, great, she's a whore. Can we go? Justin asked. She's been on campus for, 5 minutes. She skulks around with her sunglasses on and doesn't talk to anyone except Tony. Freaky, Tracy added. Heat circled and swelled under my heart. These human feelings, these hormones bubbling up under my skin, how annoying. I ran my tongue over my teeth expecting my fangs to come down. I waited no fangs. I sighed. Can we stop talking about it? I have a scrimmage, Justin said. I gritted my teeth, threw on my sunglasses, and burst out of the classroom, purposely bolting directly between them. Justin's eyes flinched, he gasped. Just barely, but I heard it as I stormed by. I descended the stairs as quickly as possible and stormed down the long hallway. Just before I pushed out into the meadow, I looked left. I was directly across from the art tower staircase. My anger rose in me so high that I wished for one horrible moment that I were a vampire again. That I had the strength of my coven to scare the life out of both Tracy and Justin. Instead, I went up to find Tony. I don't understand. What is wrong with these people? I asked. 20 minutes later I was watching the clock and pacing back and forth. Tony and I were alone in the art studio, which was nice because I could say whatever I wanted without censoring myself. I didn't even care about my tattoo anymore. I peeked at the clock again. I had 15 minutes before my next class, history. Now that I had to worry about the wrong thing, the clock was everywhere mocking me. I never had to even think about time before. I had as much as I wanted. I had forever. I've heard music before, I said, still pacing. Just not like that in a listening room. Or on a stereo, I thought to myself but decided not to mention it aloud. Tony was sketching me, despite my reminder that he hadn't yet taught me how to drive. Saturday, he said, and turned up the radio on a counter to his left. Saturday and then we can drive all over Lover's Bay. Who do they think they are? Slut. I scoffed. Tracy Sutton and Justin Enos are, like, together, Tony said from behind the cover of the sketch pad. Justin Enos is a rich kid who happens to be good at writing papers. They're going to hate you. You're smart and just trumped them at their own game. He squinted up at me and then furiously started sketching again. A different kind of music was playing on the stereo in the art tower, something with a lot of drumbeats and repeating rhythmic sounds. You're blushing, though, so maybe they should irritate you off more often. Helps with the portrait, he said, and reached for a peach-colored pencil. I rubbed at my cheeks as I walked toward the windows. Students walked to and from the many Wickham buildings. I could tell it was close to 11 by the position of the shadows on the grass. Vampires are not innately able to tell the time based on the shadows cast by the sun. It is a talent grown of necessity. Many vampires have been burned to a crisp by miscalculations. In the meadow beyond Quartz, boys ran up and down a field slamming one another in the head with a stick that had a net attached to the end. On the back of their jerseys was a number and their last names. 2 of the Enos brothers were doing this ridiculous activity. One was Justin and one was Curtis, Justin's older brother. What are they doing? I asked, and pointed at the boys. Tony got up with a pencil in hand and bopped in time to the music over to the window. Lacrosse. It's religion at Wickham. Seriously? My eyes were wide. What is lacrosse? Tony laughed, and I could see that I was a bit too literal for my own good. When you get to the library, Lena, please look it up. If you don't know what lacrosse is, you're going to be in trouble here. Not with me, Tony clarified, but with the dumb asses who care about that crap. Lacrosse. Got it, I said, and went to the door to gather my things. You see, I said, turning back to Tony, I'm already in trouble. So far, just today, I'm a slut, a know-it-all, and ugly. Tony sat down and squinted at me. Then he shaded something on the page with the tip of his ring finger. He was seated again, sketching away. Definitely not ugly, he said, and reached for a charcoal. Chapter 8. At around 3:30, I finished my last class of the day. As I came out of Hopper, I put on my sunglasses and wide-brimmed hat and stepped into the grassy meadow that spread out toward Quartz. I headed to the library for work. Instead of obsessing over Justin Enos calling me a whore, I tried to think of my new job, the prospects of the life ahead, and how many of my days would be occupied by my transition back into living, breathing life. Did I miss waltzing through my Hathersage home? Did I miss alleyways in London and other international towns, murdering and hurting innocent people as I went? No. I did not. Yet, I yearned for the faces of the coven. The men I had known for centuries. The men I had trained to be murderers. My brothers. Now that I was human, I had to think about dates and time. It was September 7th. There were 54 days before the last night of Nuit Rouge. 54 days before Vicken anticipated my awakening. 54 days before the hunt for me would begin. After taking my spot at the reference desk, I took out Professor Lin's assignment. It seemed simple: write a 5-paragraph essay and discuss one way in which Edna is awakened in Chopin's The Awakening. Use specific examples. I had time after all. My shift was from 4 until 6. I dove into research on a 5-paragraph essay. I gathered some books from the reference section and already outlined an idea for the paper when a voice said, "Can I talk to you?" I looked up. There stood Justin Enos. "No," I said, and looked back down at the outline. Really, I could not look at him. His eyes and mouth were unbelievably beautiful. He was still wearing his practice uniform and a pair of muddy sneakers. I wanted to touch the thick pieces of golden hair that stuck to his head in swirls and sticky mats. His cheeks still held a flush, and beads of sweat trickled down into his sideburns. "I have, 900 things I want to say," Justin tried to explain. Why did his lips have to pout like that? So naturally? I picked up some books and made my way into the maze of Wickham stacks. "I want to apologize," Justin said, following me. I shoved a book into a spot on a shelf and continued on through the stacks. I focused on placing the 4 books in my hand in their proper places and then returning to my desk. What Tracy said was stupid and I shouldn't have. "Save it, will you?" I said, and continued on. "Do you do that to everyone? Stand outside in the pouring rain and ask a girl about her sadness? Then make fun of her? Why even apologize?" Justin stopped in the middle of the aisle. "Tracy's just jealous. You didn't deserve that. You didn't deserve that." The phrase rang in my ears, sending vibrations through my head and echoing in my mind. I shelved the last book randomly. Then I turned toward Justin and crossed my arms on my chest. "You know what I don't understand about people?" Justin shook his head and his brow creased. He was genuinely curious. "That they revel in the sadness of others. That they genuinely want to hurt one another. I don't ever want to be that kind of person again, and I don't associate with people like that anymore." My embarrassment revealed itself through a sigh. "I'm not that kind of person," Justin said, though the expression in his eyes said that he was confused. At that moment I noticed bold lettering out of the corner of my left eye. I turned my head to look at the binding of a book. The title read, "The History of the Order of the Garter." I picked it up and placed it under my left arm. Justin took a few steps down the aisle and stood directly across from me. His chest heaved under his tight t-shirt. "You're really something," Justin said. "I mean, the way you talk. It's British." "No. I like listening to what you have to say. You're smart." I don't know if he took a step forward or if I did, but we were suddenly standing so close, Justin's lips inches from mine. He smelled sweet, like sweat. I knew that his heart was still pumping quickly and his blood was running through his veins faster than usual. I wished I could stop these calculated, vampire thoughts, but as they say, old habits die hard. "I'm smart enough to stay away from you," I whispered, though I was looking at Justin's lips. Justin leaned forward and just when I thought he would kiss me, he reached underneath my arm to take the book. I took a breath. The scent of grass was embedded into his skin. He was dangerously close to my mouth. The instinct to bite. I waited for my fangs to lower. I opened my mouth, baring my teeth only slightly. The moment Justin pulled away, I shuddered and exhaled, shaking my head quickly, and shut my mouth. "What are you reading this for?" he asked, and then flipped the book over and back. "For history class," I lied. "So, can I make it up to you?" he asked. Justin handed me the book back. He rested his right hand on the stack and kept his left hand behind his back. "Make what up to me?" "For Tracy. And me. For making fun of you today," he said, a hue of pink rising on his cheeks. "How would you do that?" I asked. "There you are," said a high-pitched voice. Justin spun around. Tracy and the other two girls in the three-piece stood at the end of the row. Tracy's hand was on her left hip. It was clear they had coordinated their outfits. They all had on different color spandex pants that clung to their small bodies and similarly matched tank tops. I felt like an underdressed giant. "Curtis said he saw you come into the library," Tracy said, and slid her arms around Justin's midsection. I turned away from Justin and headed back to my desk, pretending the conversation never happened. I would not interact with Tracy. I would not be, dare I say it, the inferior one. The other two girls, who remained at the end of the row, stared me down. One of them, the shorter one from the morning assembly, Claudia, smiled at me as I walked closer. "Nice tattoo," she said. She turned to the other girl, Kate, and shared a devious glance. "Can we see it up close?" Once Claudia was at my side, I leaned closer to her and whispered, "You have something in your teeth." There wasn't anything in her teeth, but Claudia whipped out a tiny mirror to check. I glanced back at Justin, who now had both of his hands occupied by Tracy's hips. Later that night, I ate dinner with Tony. I took a final bite of that night's American flair entree, chicken breast with a kind of cream sauce. I couldn't stop smiling while I was eating. There were so many tastes in my mouth. The woody flavor of thyme. The sharp pungency of oregano. And, of course, sugar. As we finished up dinner, I recounted what had happened with Claudia in the library. Tony was laughing so hard, I could see his back teeth. He wore a baseball hat backward and the same white t-shirt from this morning, except now it was covered in smears of charcoal and paint. "That's great. Claudia Hawthorne is such a BH." As Tony finished chewing on a bone, I noticed over his right shoulder that Justin was walking into the Union with Tracy on his arm. They separated when they walked inside and the three-piece headed toward the salad bar. They sashayed their hips, and although they were dressed in jeans and t-shirts, I wished I had changed out of the clothes I'd worn all day. Tony's eyes followed mine, so he turned his head to look. "Justin, save us a seat," Tracy called, and blew Justin a kiss. Claudia and Kate linked onto each of Tracy's arms and they got in line behind the rest of the students waiting to pile their plates with salad. "He's on this kick to go snorkeling," I listened to Tracy say. "It's still 80 degrees out," Claudia replied, and flipped her hair over her shoulder. "Yeah, but in September?" Tracy asked. "August was, like, 2 weeks ago, Tracy," Kate said, and grabbed a plate from the salad bar. I looked at Justin to see his eyes sweep over the semicircular Union. He did a survey of the tables, and when his eyes fell onto mine, he broke into a small smile. His eyes were happy, expectant. He made a beeline for our table. "What did you do to the poor kid?" Tony asked, turning to me with a mouth full of chicken. As he took another bite, I noticed that his fingertips were stained with charcoal. "What do you mean, what did I do?" He's coming over here. All I had time to do was shrug in response because Justin was next to us in a second. What's up, Sasaki? He said with a casual nod to Tony. Tony nodded back. Justin leaned both palms on the table. Can I talk to you? Justin asked me. Didn't you already? In the library? Yeah, but I want to ask you something. Justin's eyes did a quick stab at Tony and then back at me. Tony couldn't see it because he was looking at me. Anything you need to ask me, you can ask in front of Tony, I said. Tony smiled at me but with both lips closed because he was still eating. His eyes were warm, and I knew I had done something right. Whatever. I didn't get to ask you in the library. I really do feel bad about what I said. Would you want to come snorkeling with us on Saturday? Justin's expression was calm, but there was an eagerness in his eyes. The phrase snorkeling kick echoed in my head, and I thought of the way Claudia flipped her hair over her shoulder. A full day of you and your nice friends? No thanks, I said. Tony scoffed and looked down at his plate to hide his smile. I had no idea what snorkeling was, but as usual I decided it was best if I didn't mention this. I also noticed that at the salad bar Tracy kept throwing glances my way. Justin wouldn't take his eyes off me. My brothers are coming, so you won't be stuck with just me and Tracy, he added. I appraised his expression and remembered the complex emotions behind the human gaze. The way that someone's eyes can burn into you and mean something just for you, that's what Justin's look was doing. He was speaking to me without saying anything aloud. But he was holding back, I could sense it. He was looking at me casually but feeling something much more on the inside. My ability to read other people's emotions and intentions told me this, and for that I was grateful. I'll come if Tony does, I said while raising my chin. Tony, who was munching happily on the remains of a salad, stopped chewing instantly. The corners of his mouth fell, and he grabbed for a napkin. Nice. Meet us in Seeker parking lot at 1 p.m. on Saturday. Once Justin turned toward the salad bar to join Tracy, Tony swallowed and then reeled on me. Okay, so Lena, that was the first time since 8th grade or something that Justin Enos has said a word to me. I hate those guys. Every fiber of my being hates those guys. Whenever I know they're going to something, I don't go on, like, purpose. Just think of all the things you will see while snorkeling, I said. All the things you could draw. Wait. Tony blinked, the realization hitting him. He put down his fork. You think, on the boat, Tracy will wear a really revealing string bikini. So snorkeling involved a boat. Interesting. Yeah, I said, leaning in close. You'll have all kinds of body models, I said with a smile. Tony turned to look at the salad bar. This could be really good, he said. I can stare at their boobs all day and pretend it's for my art. I laughed out loud, a real laugh, from the middle of my gut. Nighttime was the most comfortable time of the day. My breathing was smooth and rhythmic. My eyes blinked more slowly, it was easier to relax. The minutes passed too quickly, though. My new human body needed more time to sleep than I would have liked. That night, I sat on the couch with my feet curled underneath me. White candle light flickered onto the hard cover of the Order of the Garter book that sat closed on the coffee table. I leaned forward and lifted the heavy leather cover with my index finger. Inside, the title page read, "A Complete History." I started to flip through the massive book, page by page. I placed the book in my lap and ran my fingers across the thick leather. The title was raised in gold caps lettering. Before I knew what I was doing, I was flipping to the chapter titled 1348, The Beginning. There, beneath the original names of the order, was a crude engraving of a portrait of a man. And underneath that engraving was the name Rod Lewin, the British knight who pledged allegiance to King Edward III. There were his fine features and his angular jaw. The engraving did no justice to the vampire I was privileged to know. I ran my fingers over the engraving, yet all my fingers could feel was the smoothness of the page. I looked at the bureau. There were the two photographs there. One of them was called a daguerreotype because it was a photo on a mirrored surface, a piece of glass no larger than a portrait photo. The daguerreotype was of the Coven and me, but I wasn't interested in that. I looked at the photograph of Rod and me. I narrowed in on Rod's ethereal glow, the regal glance in his eye, and, of course, the smirk. My stomach lurched, and I took a breath. I got up from the couch and walked with my head down into my bedroom. There was an aching in my gut. "Where are you now?" I whispered to the empty room. I left the book open on the coffee table so Rod's engraving would continue to look up at the ceiling of the living room. The candles flickered, throwing moving shadows about the apartment. The wicks snuffed out sometime in the middle of the night, but I fell asleep while they burned. I watched the flames shiver by an invisible wind. The dance of their dark shadows reminded me of home. Chapter 9. Claudia. Roy Enos yelled. Claudia clutched a pair of boys' tight white underwear in her hand and held it high above her head. She sprinted back and forth in front of Quartz dorm with Roy trailing in her wake. Eventually he tackled her, bringing her to the ground and rubbed her nose in the underwear. The rest of the Enos clan sat in a group laughing so hard Kate had to hold her hands over her stomach. I sat behind a tree, watching. Although the girls continually called me a freak, I was fascinated. Why did women in this age judge one another so bitterly? Perhaps they always had and I never knew I was forced to watch it through the ages from the outside. The days of September seemed to move with a lazy second hand. I hoped this would continue because every day that passed was one day closer to the start of Nuit Rouge. I admit I was easily distracted. Between my classes and my library job, my days at Wickham were fixed on one thing: following Justin Enos. I suppose you could say that people have auras, that the energy they harbor inside radiates from within and casts a color around their bodies. With Justin, his aura was a bright gold light. He raced speedboats and drove a fast car. He played difficult sports and, a couple times, in those first few days, he came off the lacrosse field with blood on his uniform. It wasn't that hard to follow him. Most of the time he was at his usual spot in the library, in that little atrium. Over the tops of the books I stared at his white teeth and his spiked hairstyle. I didn't even care that he was always with the three-piece and his brothers Curtis and Roy. Together, they moved like a pack of animals. The ritualistic behavior, the touching, the social interaction. I couldn't explain how comfortable this made me. This is what I did as a vampire: watched you, stared at you until I knew how your chest looked when you breathed. Then, I killed you. At Wickham, Tony was my only companion. His friendship kept me company as well as all the memories of my vampire life, piling on in my mind like a stack of books, each memory a leather binding, reaching higher and higher toward an endless ceiling. Wednesday morning, I had anatomy class at 9 a.m. The day before, at breakfast, Tony and I had happily discovered we had this class together. Anatomy would meet twice a week for 2 hours. Skull and crossbones. I asked Tony when I walked out of Seeker. He was sitting on the bench facing the parking lot, wearing a black t-shirt covered in skulls and crossbones. He was also wearing black pants and his 2 different black boots. In honor of blood and guts, he said, referring to his t-shirt. Together, we walked away from Seeker and down the path toward the science buildings. He sipped on a cup of coffee. We followed the winding path for a quarter of a mile. I, of course, walked under the shade of the branches. "What are you gonna do in the winter?" "What?" I asked. "When the leaves are off the trees and you don't have any branches to hide beneath." Well, there was a stumper. Tony turned off the path. "I'll get a bigger hat," I said, trying to smile and keep the conversation light. Science classes were held in the buildings right before the stairs to the beach. The buildings were made of red brick and shaped in a semicircle. In the center was a fountain, a bronze sculpture of Madame Curie, a scientist who discovered the element radium. She sprayed water in an arc from her hands. We walked past her and into the middle building. Tony looked me up and down. "We're inside. You can take those off." I shoved the glasses in my bag. Tony and I walked past posters for SAFE, and Biology Club, and various students passed us, younger and older, again, relatively speaking, and I watched them as much as they watched me. Tony pointed at a door at the end of the hallway. The science classes were on the first floor. "If you could be anything when you grow up, what would it be?" Tony asked. I looked down at the linoleum floor as I walked. It was newly waxed, and my boots made a sharp click as Tony and I made our way down the hallway. "I don't know," I said. "My life's been really complicated." It was true. I'd never had much to do besides read, study, and, well, murder. "Come on, there's gotta be something you like," Tony said as we finally approached the science lab door. What did I like? I twisted the onyx ring around my finger as I thought it over. I had almost forgotten I was wearing it. Though I was reminded of it in moments like this, when I wanted to think. I liked biology. I loved to investigate the workings of the human construction. Mostly for my own appetite. I looked down at my fingers working the onyx ring in circles and I stuck my hands in my pockets. The biology classroom was simple enough. There were lab tables, each with 2 at a seat. A line of windows faced the Madame Curie sculpture and underneath were cabinets. Each table had its own sink and Bunsen burner, which was a small flame used for science experiments. I followed behind Tony into the back of the room, where there was a free table. I never got a chance to answer his question because the rest of the class filed in behind us. I slid into the seat next to Tony. He sipped his coffee and then took out a book from his bag. I did the same. A young teacher came into the room, followed by a few latecomers, including Justin Enos. My heart thumped at his unexpected appearance. This was the only other class we had together besides English. I looked down, away from him, and at my blank notebook. I smoothed back my hair and threw the longer strands over my shoulder. Tony was chatting up someone in front of us, but I tried to stay focused. I wanted to stare at Justin, talk to him some more. I wanted to snorkel. I wanted it to be Saturday. AP Anatomy is the toughest class at Wickham. I tried to call in sick for the placement test last semester, but when my sister found out, she hit me on the head with a violin bow until I left to take the test. I heard Tony say to the person in front of us, "Your sister?" I asked. "I didn't know you had any siblings." "She's really into education. Rides my ass." Odd. No one had made me responsible for myself in so long that it didn't seem to matter what I did or didn't do. After all, the only reason I was there at Wickham was because Rode loved me and had died proving it. The teacher placed a briefcase on the table. Everyone reached for their notebooks, but the teacher smiled. "You can take out a piece of paper and pen, but you don't have to." "Not yet." She reached down to the floor and lifted a cooler up to the top of her desk. "I'm your AP Anatomy teacher, Ms. Tate. I'm brand new to Wickham boarding school. I hope you'll give me not only your attention but respect." No one said anything, which I suppose was appropriate. "Today, I am giving you an example of what you will be doing in my classroom this semester." She reached into the cooler, took out a white thing in a plastic bag, and placed it on the main desk so we could all see it. The bag was so cold that it was foggy inside. We couldn't see what was inside, not even me. I couldn't see through fog. "Now," Ms. Tate said, and dimmed the lights. She pulled down the screen to begin her lecture. The white thing in the plastic bag was still on the desk. I didn't want to look. I already had a hunch that it was something dead. In the moment, I couldn't have scripted it any better. Justin, who was in the front row, glanced back at me and smiled. I felt a tingle in the pit of my stomach. I smiled, too, but just barely. Miss Tate asked if anyone did the summer reading. No one did. "Well, if you did, you would know we're starting this semester with blood." Despite everything in my body, I rolled my eyes. The lights clicked off. I instinctively looked around me at the classroom now shrouded in a grey light. Miss Tate flipped on a switch at the back of a small machine at the front of the room. There was a low, fluttering sound, kind of like a hum. Then an image of a human heart, a real heart, shined onto a screen. It was like a magnifying glass, only very large. Another piece of technology, another marvel of the modern world. "Now," Miss Tate said, "if any of you had done the summer reading, then you would be able to identify the key elements of the heart." "They are they," Miss Tate was leading. No one answered. But I knew. I could hear Rode in my mind. We were in London in a tavern late at night. I had only been a vampire for 4 days and I had so many questions. Even though I was watching Miss Tate point at the 3 unmarked sections of the heart, I could only hear Rode. "You will have instincts now that you didn't before." "Like?" I asked. The rain pelted the windows of a British tavern in the 15th century. The flicker of the candles made Rode's porcelain features glow, and I wondered if I looked the same in his eyes. Around us, men and women clinked glasses and ate stew from ceramic bowls. I looked at the hearty stew but turned away, uninterested. You will know exactly which part of the neck to bite. You will become an expert on creatures that you never knew existed. You will feed and you will sink your teeth with such precision that your prey will die instantly. Over the years, this technique was perfected, but Rode was right. If you bit into the jugular vein on the neck, then it would be connected to the right ventricle, which was responsible for pumping blood in and out of the heart. It was the most direct way. The most pleasurable way. Because the vampire bite was not painful, it was the most complete feeling of satisfaction that a human could ever experience. The lights clicked back on in the biology classroom, but the mood had changed dramatically. Miss Tate was monstrously disappointed that no one had done their summer reading. After snapping on plastic gloves, she took the white mass out of the bag. A couple of the girls gasped, and one of them shrieked. Miss Tate dropped the dead body of a cat onto a metal plate. Yes, I know, shocking. But this is physiology, so you better get used to the idea of dealing with dead specimens in this class. I couldn't help it. I was rising up in my seat to get a better look. Furthermore, you should all recognize this as a cadaver of a cat. A girl in the front row burst into tears, gathered her things, and ran out of the room. As the door closed behind her, Ms. Tate looked back to the room and spoke in a much softer tone. This is an AP-level class. Achieving an A will ensure that you will not only be in advanced classes in your college years but will put you ahead when compiling your applications. Anyone else who has a problem cutting open or dealing with dead specimens should leave now. Miss Tate moved the cat to the top of a rolling cart. The cart was similar to those in the library, except underneath it were scalpels, tiny knives, and assorted tubes. Anyone want to brave the cat? Cut her open so we can take a look inside and see for the first time perhaps what it means to see how a body works. No one did. I looked left at Tony, who was staring at Ms. Tate with wide eyes. I glanced forward at Justin's rigid back. Cut it open? It was dead already, so there was no sport in it. Besides, I felt no fear of something dead. I looked around. A guy in the front row doodled on a piece of paper. A girl next to him flipped through pages in her textbook and kept her eyes to the desk. Death was the ultimate fear to mortals. I breathed a weighted sigh. I could take breaths and feel the warmth of my fingers, though I was no human. I was a killer, a vampire stuck in the body of a 16-year-old girl. I raised my hand. What would be so hard about dealing with a dead carcass? Miss Tate smiled wide. I didn't anticipate anyone actually being brave enough. Ms. Bodanti, please come up. Every single person turned around to stare directly at me. Justin raised his eyebrows. I walked up the center aisle and placed my hand out to take the knife. No, Lena. You need gloves. Oh, right. Of course, I said, and took a pair of latex gloves in Miss Tate's outstretched hand. The cat was skinned, without fur, and had been preserved in formaldehyde for so long that it didn't even really look like a cat anymore. The skin was pruned as though all the water had been sucked out of it. The mouth was open, and the tongue was yellow and a pasty white. In my past life I would have ripped the thing open with my teeth, but this was a mortal life now. Bacteria and germs mattered. I put on the plastic gloves, which smelled like rotten eggs. I used the tiny knife and cut the rubbery carcass so it exposed the preserved insides. As the tiny knife cut through the skin, I felt a slack in my shoulders and I exhaled for one brief moment. I was doing something I knew, cutting open a body. The carcass had already been pre-cut, but I wanted to make sure I could expose the heart. So I used my fingers and pulled the skin open a little more. The pressure of the rubbery, dead skin against my fingers reminded me of the many nights the coven spent digging holes in the earth. I helped them pick up the bodies and heave them into the ground. This cat had been dead 6 weeks. A few people gasped behind me. A lens suspended above the tray projected the image of the cat onto a screen. Yes, Ms. Tate explained. The cat's innards are too small for me not to project them. So, Tony Sasaki, she said, checking a class roster, where should Lena point if she wants to show us the right ventricle? Tony immediately started flipping through his textbook. He said, stalling. I see Mr. Sasaki has also not done the reading. A couple of students laughed. What about the left ventricle, Tony? I thought Ms. Tate was kind of relaxed initially, but now she was picking on Tony, my friend. His cheeks were red, and students were starting to stare, even Justin. The way you phrased the question is confusing, ma'am, I said without giving her time to stop me. The right ventricle is on the left, but only to the animal. To us, it's on the right side, facing me. I just kept going. This is the ventral part of the cat. I pointed at the body of the animal. Because the cat is on its back and the stomach is exposed. Miss Tate crossed her arms in front of her body and let me finish explaining the particular portions of the heart that I could remember. What is the system called? Miss Tate asked. Her blue eyes were fixed on me. I could tell she wanted me to be right. She wanted me to explain it correctly, not like Professor Lin, the English teacher, who wanted to make a fool out of me. I thought of the books in my Hathersage library and the nights looking at diagrams by candlelight. The circulatory system, I said honestly, and handed the tiny knife over. Thank you, Ms. Bodanti, she said. I knew I ripped that cat open as a test for myself. To see if being human would make death and decomposition more difficult to bear. It didn't. My heart fluttered, and I blinked my eyes. I ate, drank, and slept. I did what a human did, sure. But so far, humanity was mocking me. In the moment I pried the folds of the cat's skin open, I felt nothing but a relief from frustration. When I sat back down next to Tony, Ms. Tate continued with her lecture. What Ms. Bodanti discussed today is in Chapter 5 of the reading. Clearly she has had some experience with cat dissection. Ms. Tate paused, and I felt Tony lean closer to me. He smelled like musk. A human musk, earthy. We are so going to get A's, Tony whispered. My eyes darted to the front of the room, where Justin Enos was looking back over his shoulder and smiling at me. The rest of the audiobook will be continued in the next episode. Join us on Patreon for early access or more great audiobooks. A link is provided in the video description.